Good evening. How are you all doing this evening? Excellent. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Seema Sueko. I serve as the Deputy Artistic Director here at Arena Stage, and I'm always so excited to see so many people join us for our civil dialogues. How many of you have come to our civil dialogues in the past? Excellent, excellent. Well, great. So you know the drill. You know, a lot of the reason why we started doing this was on our stages, we try to present work that hopefully will be thought provoking and have you leaving the theater thinking and examining a multiplicity of perspectives. And we do that with our work on stage. And about 3 years ago, Dr. Amitai Etzioni approached us about doing it independent of our work on stage. That we're living in a time where people seem to be very hungry to dive deep into issues, hear a diversity of perspectives, and to speak with one another. So, again, thank you so much for joining us for this. What I like to do to start us off for our civil dialogues is whet your dialogue maker by asking you to turn to somebody you do not know and just take 30 seconds and share why you came this evening, and then listen to the other person for 30 seconds on why they came this evening. Now, again, it has to be with somebody you don't know. So go ahead, take some time. So you had a chance to get to know one another. Excellent. Now, my one last directive before I turn it over to Dr. Etzioni is to take a moment to silence any noisemaker you might have on you as well. If you could just take a moment to put that to silent mode, that would be terrific. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amitai Etzioni, our partner in crime on this civil dialogues. Thank you.
First sign of affection here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Seema. This has been indeed three wonderful, very productive years working with you as an arena stage. We created a lot of dialogues, and you can find them on our arena stage archives, and you can find them on YouTube. We have surprisingly large number of people who come and visit and benefit from previous discussions. They were all civil. We even had, if you go back and dig, we had an occasion where we had Trump supporters and Trump opponents on stage together, and we had a civil discussion. I should disclose you a secret how we do that. Before we go on stage, we tell them that they're in a theater and there are trap doors underneath their seats. And if they're not civil, they end up in a Chinese re-education camp. So in the past that worked. Today it is unnecessary because I know I met with the panel. They don't need any trap doors. So I just a few words of introduction, and then we have a very excellent panel. So this is extremely complicated issue, the question of our environmental and climate changes, challenges, and a very large variety of perspectives and ways to address this question. We're going to take just one cut at it, or at least focus on one cut on it. But let me say, we'll take for granted certain things. We take for granted that there is a major challenging crisis. We take for granted that humans are a major factor in causing this crisis. And we take for granted that we all need to do something about that, and that we can do something about that. So that we're not going to discuss. We're going to take it for granted. If you accept it, as I think most people do, the question arises, how best to do that? And there we run into a problem of the tension between social change and a democratic society. And so my daughter-in-law, Betsy Cavendish, sent me an excellent quote from a scientist, which is too long to read to you, but I'm going to summarize. And what the scientist said, you know, I did this as a scientist, this work for 30 years, I studied the causes of pollution and environment and all the challenges, and I thought that science could fix it. I was wrong. The problem is not a problem of science, it's a problem of greed, of selfishness. And the only way we're going to cure that if there's going to be a spiritual arising. And let me tell you, these lines really warmed my heart because, frankly, as a moderator, I'm not allowed to have opinion, but I'll be forgiven if I tell you that's exactly what I believe. But before I came over, I went to Amazon and I looked to order a spiritual revival, and I couldn't find one. This is my way of saying these are very hard to come by. And so the question we need to ask ourselves, especially if we agree that this is a difficult, burning, serious challenge, can we meet the public halfway? Can we not start from the assumption that we're going to find a way to profoundly, deeply change the public on short order? Now, to be fair, the environmentalist movement, climate, people who work on climate, have done a great job, and they really have succeeded more than many other groups in changing people's hearts and minds. And they have made considerable progress, not just in people talking better, but changing their behavior, supporting laws. But it seems, I think it's fair to say, that the change they achieved are not commensurate to what is called for. So the question is, to put it in very blunt words, can we find shortcuts? Can we make it easier to accommodate? That's really at least one of the issues we want to focus on tonight. So one way to think about it is in terms of, could we find technologies which would make it easier to deal with these challenges so we will not have to change our behavior? Because on the one hand, we hear that we have to dial down, we have to consume less, travel less, not even international travel maybe. We have to emit less. Now it's true, the environmentalists will tell us it's all this pain, these various measures, costs, compensate for this, all the wonderful things. Our house will not be flooded, our house will not be burned down. But I think if you approach the average citizen and say you have to pay more for your gasoline, you have to pay more for air conditioning, you have to pay more for heating, you have to pay more for everything that's been transported, but your house will not burn down, your city will not be flooded. I'm not sure they're going to buy that bargain. So again, it comes back to the question, can we find technologies which will make it easier? Or, and I'm going to close on that, are in effect these new technologies just adding to the problem? So for instance, many of us, when we look at ethanol, which was supposed to be part of the cure, find out that in order to produce the corn, transport the corn, process the corn, but it first of all creates almost as many externalities as it saves or more, and then we put it into our cars. Some people tell us it hurts our engines. So this is the question. Can we find technological shortcuts to ease the pain, not to replace the need to change our behavior, but to meet the public halfway? Or is this an illusion which adds to the problem? Ladies and gentlemen, here is the answer to my question.
All right, so thank you very much, and thank you also to Samantha and Lauren for organizing. So I'm Claire Brunel, I'm an environmental economist, and I guess since we have a spectrum of opinions, I'm going to start by stating my bias. I'm relatively on the optimistic side. I'm going to temper my comments every once in a while about some of the things that I think are some of the challenges that we're facing. But let me first start by talking about some of the examples that we have that really show kind of the power of these technologies, which is that, we have in the EU and the United States, we've seen actually emissions of pollutants decrease from the manufacturing sector in the past couple of decades. And so, one of the things that I've done in my work is try to figure out how have we managed to do it? Because depending on how you do it, it is more or less easy for other countries to replicate it. And so there's different channels through which this can happen, but if I can summarize very briefly, basically what we've seen is that production, the quantity of production has gone up, and they've actually specialized more and more in the goods that are traditionally polluting. So all of this predicts an increase in emissions, and really, in fact, what we're seeing is a decrease in emissions, and this has been entirely possible because of changes to the production process that have a lot to do with technology. So this is one of the experiences that we have. This shows that, if we want to reduce emissions, to me, technologies are an essential, necessary part of the story. But, it kind of depends on how we implement them. So we have these challenges coming our way in terms of the climate, but also in terms of the fact that, with rising living standards, with rising population numbers, we are facing a huge increase in the demand for energy. And so then the choices that we have to be actually able to reduce emissions from this is switch to clean energy or improve energy efficiency as well. But the problem to me is not with these technologies, it's with the policies that we have that encourage the use of those technologies. Because the policies that we're putting in place have distributional consequences. And this is one of the challenges that we're going to face, is the fact that you're putting policies in place to encourage people to put solar panels on their rooftops, or to switch to energy efficient appliances, or to make their home more energy efficient. All of these have a much higher incentives for people who spend a lot of money on energy. And who spends a lot of money on energy? The high-income households, because they consume more energy, and because the more energy you consume, the higher the price that you face. And so therefore, the policies, those tax credits that you're giving for energy-efficient appliances or for solar panels, are going to increasingly benefit the high-income households and not the low-income households, that could benefit a lot more in the long term from those energy savings that those technologies provide. So this, to me, is one of the challenges. But what we need are policies that give the right types of incentives and that have the right consequences on a distributional effect. It doesn't mean that renewable energy technologies or energy efficient technologies are not part of the solution. Now, technologies are not just good in terms of being able to reduce emissions. They also have this really important role, which is to allow us to figure out where is the problem. We've had things like satellites that have allowed us to understand how fast deforestation is happening, where it's happening on a very localized level. We also have put sensors, pollution sensors, on drones, on cars, on airplanes, that again have allowed us to figure out not just how much pollution you have at the level of the country, but at a very localized level in the city, what are the parts of the city that are particularly suffering from pollution? What are the populations? So what's the demographic characteristics of people in that part of the city that are particularly hurt? And they really help us figure out what are the right policies to put in place, who are the people that we need to protect more than others, because there are justice concerns about these levels of pollution. And pollution, keep in mind, is not just about changing the climate. You also have very significant health consequences that affect you for your entire lifetime. Being affected to pollution, if your mom is affected to pollution when you are in utero, you're going to have a smaller birth weight, and that is associated with lower earnings for your entire lifetime. Taking an exam like the SATs on a day that is polluted is going to lead you to have lower test scores and therefore get into a lower university. And so if you have people who are in parts of the city that are subject to higher levels of pollution, they're going to be more hurt, and they're going to have lower lifetime earnings, etc. My point being that with these new technologies, we've been able to identify exactly where the pollution comes from, how important the extent of the pollution, and how it's also spreading throughout the city by wind patterns, etc. And so I see a real potential for technologies, but I think that we have to be careful about the policies that we put in place to encourage the use of these technologies. And I'll stop there.
The program tonight's advertised as, are you an optimist or a pessimist about technology? I don't think the question is whether we are optimistic or pessimistic. I think the question to be asked is technology the right or the wrong solution to climate change? And the answer is in part yes, but certainly in part no. Climate change is not just a single problem. It's part of a systemic loss of the stability of the Earth's system. And unless you look at that entire system and simply focus on technology as a solution to rising temperature or rising ocean levels, we're going to miss this. And that's one of the problems with technology in general. It tends to be a symptomatic remedy. It's more efficient. That means we get more income, more production. It reduces the amount of pollution in the air. That's a very good thing. But shouldn't we be really looking at why we have this phenomena called climate change and global warming, why we have levels of inequality that are obscene? And technology can blind us and turn us away. The systems dynamics folks that I worked with at MIT when I was still active have a name for this. They call it shifting the burden. When you think you have the answer to the problem and you begin to apply it, you're shifting the burden away if you haven't searched out the root causes. So it's a behavioral pattern that's everywhere. It's in your homes, it's in your businesses, it's in your schools, it's everywhere. And it can become more and more pathologic as you continue to look at that single solution as your way to solve all these systemic problems. It becomes an addiction. And in some ways, the US and the modern world has become addicted to technology. We turn to it to solve problems that it was the cause of. So I'm going to just stick with climate change. There are clearly technologies that will help to reduce the immediate threats of climate change. Renewable energy, I'm sure my colleague here will talk about more. And even though I might argue that we have to look deeper, they make good sense today. But if we stop and think that we've got it solved, we're going to do harm to our grandchildren. Because the real roots of climate change are economic growth, material consumption. We're a consumerist world, and the rest of the world wants to be more like us. So maybe I disagree with you, Amitai, or maybe I just am sort of taking a little bit different tack. But without behavioral change, without social change, without changing the metrics that make us measure what life is all about, without changing our political economies from one that's based on economic growth, even with the foreseeable reductions in material efficiency, or increases in material efficiency, that is, more GDP, but a little less output, any kind of technology that we're looking at now in 30 or 40 years is going to be overwhelmed by just simple growth. So we ought to look at it carefully, but not let us blind us to the real source.
Good evening. I'm Jonathan Silver, and I think I'm up here representing that small sliver of society that doesn't have a PhD. But I'll do my best to keep up. I'm probably actually on the panel because I assume I have the slot of raging optimist. My work is largely around identifying new technologies that can materially impact the issues that have been raised, investing in them and trying to help these companies grow and really have the kind of impact that they can. Are the new technologies solutions or problems? Well, really, at my simplistic level, there are two kinds of technologies, right? Those that solve the problem, solar, wind, and others, and those that cause the problem, oil and gas exploration, transportation, scale agriculture, and the like. They are not ipso facto good or bad. They just have impacts. Technology is a neutral thing. The question is, how do you use the technology, or how do you ameliorate the negative impacts of the technologies? And all the businesses that we work with and those in our portfolio are focused on doing that. I think it's also relevant to identify the time frames we're talking about, because technologies can be a solution or they can be a problem. When I was in the Obama administration and ran the federal government's investments in clean energy, and we were the first investors in Tesla. I think you can make an argument that electric vehicles are a significant improvement over cars with an internal combustion engine. You can also make the argument that they are themselves a transition technology, probably to a hydrogen environment, a hydrogen vehicle environment. And then we start to get into the question of what do you do to dispose of all those lithium-ion batteries? So again, technology is a neutral, and the time frame matters as to whether or not it's a good or a bad. Overall, as a raging optimist, I think to be an investor and an entrepreneur and a venture capitalist, you have to be a raging optimist. But overall, new technology, in my opinion, has been incredibly beneficial. There are 400,000 jobs in the solar industry today, and there were 0, 10, 12, 15 years ago. They are also replacement jobs, if you will. There are 50,000 miners left in the United States today. So effectively the war on coal, the war with coal, the war about coal is over. And now the question will turn quickly to cleanup and remediation. But the point is, there were once 400,000 miners. So technology is not necessarily a job killer. It's in fact a job creator. It's just that they are different jobs. Public policy is an incredibly important part of this process, and there is no industry more heavily regulated than the energy industry. And my colleagues up here are far more equipped than I am to tell you how good public policy ought to be made in this area. But for me, public policy is not a solution, it's a framework, because it's the private sector that has to implement the policy. And so good public policy is whatever works to incentivize, to drive the private sector to do the kinds of things that we want done. And there's a close and necessary and symbiotic relationship between the public sector and the private sector here. It's not enough to demonize companies for the work that they do unless the public policy is geared towards having them do something different. Having said that, while I'm a raging optimist, I'm also not naive. Technology can bite back. This is probably an audience that would find autonomous vehicles a very attractive technology, and indeed, for all kinds of reasons, it will be. On the other hand, I suppose if you interviewed any of the million cab drivers out there, you'd find that there was mixed opinion on that. So the challenge is not how do we stop autonomous vehicles from being brought forward, but how do we manage the transition for not just the million taxi drivers, but all the long-haul truckers and everybody else that'll be involved in this transition as well. That's a matter of public policy, but it's also, to the earlier point, a matter of behavioral transformation and the social compact. And SpaceX is an example of a technology that's great and can bite back. Why is it great? It's reusable space rockets, sending satellites out and all kinds of things. On the other hand, if you talk to the machinists, the welders, the steel workers, et cetera, who build rockets on a one-off basis, less exciting. But the solution isn't to stop innovating, it's to create better public policy, and specifically around education and income transfer. This is not the evening to talk about universal basic incomes, but it is a part of the solution. A solution around economics is part of the solution. Couple quick points and then I'll wrap up. The climate crisis is existential. So technical solutions are imperative. We had an early conversation before we all came out, and I have to admit that while I'm a raging optimist about technology, I'm not as sanguine about where we actually are in the process. I suspect 2 degrees has come and gone, and the next set of issues we have to work on is how we handle the repercussions of that. And the solution will involve technology. But the climate crisis will create a whole set of new issues: human migration, medical diseases, a reordering of ecosystems. You've all read about the bees, but I bet you don't know that most tree species are moving north now at about 6 feet a year. That may not sound like much, but it transforms how ecosystems behave. So technology is integral to addressing those issues. I want to wrap up by saying that there are also 2 different kinds of technologies: incrementalist technologies and breakthrough technologies. I am not nearly as smart or as successful as Bill Gates, but to me, Bill Gates is part of the problem, because Gates is running around saying that we can't solve this problem unless we have radical breakthrough technologies. Because he is so well-versed and so successful, it has the effect of freezing the deployment of technologies we have today. We could solve a large percentage of our problems with massive deployments around various kinds of renewable energy technologies and others in what I have come to call the clean economy rather than clean energy. I will stipulate that we can't solve the last 10, 15, 20%. But we better get started on the first 80%, or we have a big, big problem. Essentially, the battle is over, right? Clean energy won. Right? The things that they're debating down the road here are not about whether or not clean energy. They're about the speed of implementation. And we wouldn't care about the speed of implementation generically if the outcomes weren't so binary and one of them weren't so potentially catastrophic. We don't have the luxury of the decades of transition from one fuel source to another that we've had in eras past. So we've got to move today. And if you want a date to mark your calendars, to point to when the clean energy war was won, on April 7th, I think, of 2018, the National Coal Museum in Lexington, Kentucky, put solar panels on its roof.
Well, there's some irony. Well, I'm Andrea Simonelli, and I think I work at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I guess I come at this from really the externality side of it, because I think we all sit in a really privileged position to sit here and talk about this. The world is heating. Not this room right now, because I'm freezing. But outside of that, I work on mostly climate displacement and looking at how local governance in small island states are handling all of these challenges coming to them. And so the externalities of what this looks like, even at the 2 degrees Celsius level, or we're about 1.7 right now, so pretty close, is really what their lives look like, what they're trying to implement, how they're attempting to grasp green technology, sometimes over human security outcomes in their own countries, which is a really precarious situation for many of them to be making choices about, in terms of trying to show us, right? Hey, if we can do it, you guys can do it. And oftentimes this is really at the detriment of really more important things that many of these countries need to do. And so I'm more on the pessimistic side because I see people struggling to get us to care enough to start being serious. Because even if you're not going to find that silver bullet technology, and it shouldn't to keep us doing what we're doing because we're consuming like locusts, and frankly, even if we stabilize the greenhouse gases, we're going to use everything here first anyway, just to have more stuff to put in our garages. But nonetheless, I'm watching people struggle to just want the basics. So I've done a lot of work in places like the Maldives and Tuvalu and Kiribati and the Marshall Islands and Samoa and Fiji. I'm probably missing something. There's a lot of island hopper flights, and when you do that enough times, you're just like, where am I today? And a lot of these governments are taking all these initiatives differently, but their goal is to try to, absorb these green technologies, and they really want to do this quickly. But what I watch is societies that used to be sustainable become unsustainable because of the push of all of our value systems. So, the consumption and all of the neat stuff that we have, there's nothing worse than watching Christmas tinsel in the flowing waters of the reef. What is that, okay? Like, that is terrible. Among plenty of other issues. And just wondering how we're going to attack this. Because for us, we go, oh yes, it's terrible, as I go back to my heated or air-conditioned place and I divide all of my recycling, and yes, this is a terrible thing. Oh, an autonomous vehicle. These are all things that are our cause and our problem and things that we have to be dealing with, but we're still the ones that are slow, even though this country is at 50-50 split potentially still, and is this happening? Where I spend my time, this is their daily lives. Water catchment's the only way that they're dealing with keeping drought conditions under control. The importation of food is what's necessary because atolls don't grow much food. There's not much there. And so for all of the factory farming and everything that we do here, and subsidizing of our farmers, we keep that low. But when they get shipped our produce, a pint of strawberries is $26. And that got flown there. Yay, more carbon. So only one minister, who's, to be fair, it's probably the environmental minister, he's something else, in the Marshall Islands, will buy that. There's very few people who could afford this. So when I think of the type of externalities that we think of with ethanol, with all of these pieces, my first thought is to us honestly starting not just talking about it in a pithy, it's an intellectual evening for us sense, but a real straight conversation of what it takes for us to change our lifestyles. Because where I spend time, their lifestyle is more simple. And we've come to just relish our self-importance, right? Look at us on our phones, and we don't have the stuff, everything's so fancy. But it's really thinking through what our lifestyles mean to us and how much of it we're willing to sacrifice. Not because it's so amazing that we have to keep it, but what is it that we're doing that is so of value that has to be kept in this manner? So, for example, when I see just basics, things that can be made more simply that don't even need the technology. So in some of the islands, they'll weave bandana sleeves into bags. And so that's your reusable shopping bag, which is amazing because every few days you can just make a new one and it naturally grows, ta-da. But instead, you've got plastic bags everywhere. And just like here at Safeway, they'll charge you 5 cents in Fiji. And so this low-income country is charging its people to go ahead and pollute its own waters. And we think about the consumption and all of these things that we've made that made our lives better. And as the demand moves out into other places, that doesn't make their life better when they already had a way to handle this before our way of life got involved. So I think the heavy lift of all of this is really on us, and to maybe take a page out of their playbook, that a more simple life used to be enjoyable. Spending time with each other, not on your screen. You know, Netflix isn't the end all be all of our existence. And then how much I enjoy spending time in places where people will have festivals, and the main source of wealth is showing how well you can take care of your village, not the accumulation of crap in your garage. So I don't want to be pessimistic. I think we need green energy technologies to make that for us. But I'm concerned about, unless we start taking that seriously, what value systems we continue to export. Because otherwise, this just keeps getting worse.
Wow, this has been absolutely excellent introduction to the subject, and we heard optimists and pessimists, in the middle list, whatever they are. So just because you were also parsimonious, we have time to one more quick round before we ask everybody else to join the conversation. And if you indulge me, I'd like to ask you two specific questions. We go the other way around this time, maybe. And so, but maybe you can just deal with two specific questions. One is the question about the international society. Here is the problem which I guess we have to deal with. If Americans would say, fine, we'll tighten our belt, we'll agree to all kind of policies, drive less, use bike more, and so on and so on. But India just made a contract with Australia to buy $7 billion worth of the dirtiest coal there is, and Australia was all too happy to sell it to them. And for us to go to the Chinese and say, well, you're not entitled to drive cars, that was for us, that's not going to work. So how can we do any of that without having a true international effective system, which doesn't look like it's around the corner, and without that, Americans would feel like suckers if they would participate. So the first question is, can we internationalize the solution? And if we cannot, do we have to look some completely different ways to proceed? And finally, I want to ask a very specific technological question, but I need a brief introduction why I'm asking it. So in the 1920s, we faced the following situation, that the population was growing very, very rapidly, that the farmers were not able to produce more food because they were using human and animal waste as fertilizers, and they simply couldn't poop more, forgive me. And as a result, it looked like there going to be massive starvation. And there came a scientist in Berlin by the name of Haber, and he said, you know what, in the air is that stuff called nitrogen. I'm going to get it out, and we're going to have an artificial fertilizer, and voila, 2 billion people got their dinner. So he's widely credited with having invented artificial fertilizers, which changed the condition of the world. Now, I imagine another scientist having a good night, well, maybe a whole group of them, and they find out how to take carbon out of there. Or to put it a little more technically, why would not a major drive to build technologies which capture and store carbon be a relatively painless solution compared to others? Now, I'm not arguing that we don't, therefore we should stop all the other good stuff. I can't emphasize enough. I'm not saying, therefore, we should emit all they want and not worry about plastic in the ocean. What I'm saying is, in the struggle between various competing items, should we give a priority to a technology which is not imposing pain on the public, which makes it more likely that we can find support in a democratic society? So can we internationalize? And why don't you love carbon capture and storage?
Two very big things. Well, I spent quite a bit of time going back and forth to meetings at the UNFCCC the last few years, and so that's your big climate meeting where all the countries come together and yell at each other for 2 weeks. First unofficially, and then the second week officially, which is a lot of fun. There's a big party on Saturday. I'm not kidding. Like the NGOs throw a party. It's fun. But the one good thing I can say coming out of this has been that the middle-income countries, while that is their demand, well, hey, if you guys do it, what about us? Unfortunately, we are seeing this coal problem between India and Australia. But more than that, we see technology transfer initiatives in places that, unlike us, are not path dependent, which has been nice. So what we can do more of, and I have seen already starting, is this sort of leapfrogging of this was ugly. Do you really want to clean up? Like, have you seen America in the 70s? It wasn't so pretty. Jumping ahead into green technology and in that investment for their energy sources starts that process of putting them path dependently on something cleaner and jumping ahead of the game. That making the case that we had a linear trajectory that we didn't know better, and then when we did, oops, is not the way you want to follow. And luckily, some middle-income countries are already making that step in terms of technology transfer that we're seeing with the Green Climate Fund, and that's been positive. So it's not been a negative black hole. With carbon capture, I think the hardest part with that is still really convincing people that it won't just give us the free rein to go do whatever and still just use all the coal and use all the oil, because it's still economically viable for many countries. So I think that's where you get the pushback. I think that in terms of where we are now and the lag in models of what this is going to look like for many, many years to come, the heating and the sea level rise that will ensue in terms of whatever else I'm already seeing. Yeah, I got to watch the melting glaciers this summer and be underwater in the Great Barrier Reef dying. It was a very depressing summer for me. We're going to need it, but I think you're still going to see heavy pushback in the environmental community because there's going to be the just inherent view that it will be a free-for-all for oil.
I want you to feel better than this.
By the way, I do this with my students every day. I go in and I teach environmental security, and I'm like, I am your ray of terrible sunshine. Like, I am the sun burning you. And they only find it semi-funny because they really do rise.
These are real problems, and they are significant, and they are at scale, and everything that has been said, I think, is accurate. They are also solvable because we created them. And there is an enormous amount of work going on all over the world in commercial deployment and innovation around new technologies to solve these problems. There's a company called Carbon Engineering, which is sucking carbon out of the air. It's demonstration scale, and you'd probably need one the size of Texas to really have a meaningful impact, but it's a beginning. It's a demonstration project. When we financed...
Sorry to interrupt. Did you find some bit of covering Texas? Is that?
What's that? When we provided the initial funding for Tesla to buy the plant that it now uses in Fremont, California, and not only were there no electric vehicles, but the price of an electric vehicle was astronomically high. There is now not a single car manufacturer in the world that does not have an electric vehicle either in its lineup or in production and coming. And there are big auto companies like Volkswagen which are converting their entire lineup to electric vehicles. There are thousands and thousands of examples like this in any area that you have concern about, which does not mean that we're far along the path of fixing it, but we are far along the path of knowing that we need to fix it. I gave a talk at a business school a few months ago, and the moral of the story, I was asked to talk to the Energy and Environment Club before giving the bigger talk. It turns out there are hundreds of students in the Energy and Environment Club. Now, I'm sure there are thousands of students in the Investment Banking Club, but the moral of the story is that 5, 6, 7 years ago, there wasn't an Energy and Environment Club. I have teenagers at home. I learned to recycle. They were born to recycle. The first thing my daughter says when we go to a restaurant and a waiter or waitress comes up is, "Don't bring us any straws," which is great. But you know, you can't get a non-biodegradable straw in the District of Columbia anymore. All right, so they've been outlawed. You can't. There are no plastic straws here, and there are no plastic straws in several states. We got a long way to go, but I don't want you to think that the work is not underway, that it's not important, that it's not had a meaningful impact, and that it's not going to continue to grow. With respect to what are sometimes called equities around who gets it, you know, what we had, what others had, I think that Andre's made a very important point about technology transfer. Look, it's not egalitarian. It's never been egalitarian, and it isn't going to be egalitarian tomorrow. Okay? What's important is that as we develop these technologies, we roll them out as quickly as we can around the world. And by the way, the side benefit of that is places that have been you know, even worse off now get better. As we're building, there's a lot of work going on now, for example, in Africa in terms of renewable power projects that are being put up. That's causing entire villages to have light and energy and all kinds of things that are necessary to bring those communities up. I'm not a hand over eyes optimist. I hope I'm a practical optimist, but this is a giant it's a giant need, but as a result for a business person and an investor, it's a giant opportunity. And there are tremendous fortunes to be made in this space, which is one of the reasons people will be attracted to it. I wish it weren't the case that we didn't have to solve these things, but as long as they are, we need to make sure that there's a market for these technologies and that our public policies do that. That's the solution. That's the mechanism by which we develop these solutions.
Thanks, Jonathan. These are problems of the globe. We'll just focus on climate change. It's a global problem. I would say it's hopeless to look for. We're not going to solve the problem with technology. The language is one which just continues to give us more hope than not. The technology will be the answer. If we don't get together with the rest of the world and take on this concern together, it's not going to be solved in any way. Because we're evaluating the potential of technologies like carbon capture, for example, but mostly in terms of today's, maybe 5 years. But this planet's still growing, and it's demanding materials, and it's demanding energy one way or another. And if you just look out a generation, which we ought to be, we all have children, and they're going to have children, and their children are going to have children. We've got to take on this as a global systemic problem. There is no other way. I will be didactic, pedantic, forceful, whatever language you want. No, not Malthusian. Well, maybe Malthusian. That's good. It is good. Malthus was probably right. He didn't have any idea of this kind of stuff. He was worried about feeding, but that's also a problem today. We haven't mentioned that. But we're not solving these problems. Solving means, in my view, making them go away. So someday, nobody's going to have to talk about climate change. So I don't see any way out the Paris agreements and all of the work toward climate change and global warming since Kyoto, it's a step in the direction that has to go, and pulling back from it it's really crazy. I'm not talking about politically one way or another, but it's going in absolutely the opposite direction. We need more international cooperation, not less. It just isn't going to happen that way. And as far as carbon capture, if it can be made efficient enough, and that's really a challenge today, it takes about as much energy to remove a pound of CO2 as it does to produce it. It's a technology that ought to be considered, but it is one with many, many potential side effects. I mean, where are you going to put all this CO2 that you've taken out? Pump it down in the ground and hope, optimistically think it's going to stay there. Well, we don't know. So it's like all of the technologies Jonathan's talking about. It really does deserve to be carefully evaluated, but I mean carefully. That is both looking at its potential. But even that isn't going to solve the problem of climate change.
All right, I have so much to say about everything that was said. I'm going to try to keep it short. So first, I completely agree that what we really need is a change in behaviors, right? We need to consume less. That's absolutely what we need. I'm just a lot less optimistic about humans' ability to actually change their behavior, which is why I think that technologies are going to play a major role, because we've been terrible at changing our behaviors, and it's only in situations of catastrophic outcomes like day zero hitting for water supply in Cape Town that we actually saw humans changing their behaviors, right? And when it comes to climate change, we can't wait until the last moment. What we do today is going to impact how everything behaves in the future. So I am quite pessimistic about human behavioral changes, and therefore it makes me more optimistic about technologies. Now, one of the things that I mentioned during my remarks was that technologies have been efficient at reducing emissions so far, and so one of the reasons that this is good news is because this can easily be replicated by other countries as long as they have access to these technologies, which goes back to a point that Andrea was talking about the transfers of technologies. And this is my response to your international cooperation question. One of the things that we've been really bad at so far is the transfers of these technologies are going to happen if things like, or organizations like the World Trade Organization actually liberalize the trade of these technologies. Now, is the World Trade Organization going to be alive in a few months since the US doesn't want to renew the budget? We're not sure. But countries have come together and they've tried to negotiate the liberalization of those environmental technologies, but they can't even agree on what is the list of environmental goods and services, let alone on what they're going to do to actually liberalize this trade. And then once, even if they could agree on the list and start negotiating, they just keep picking the low-hanging fruit that really doesn't do that much at the beginning, right? They want to reduce tariffs, so those are taxes at the border on imports of these technologies. But the thing is, the main obstacle to the transfers of these technologies so far have been, well, they're also tariffs, but they're not the kinds of tariffs that they're talking about. But the US, the EU, and China are in a three-way trade war about environmental goods and services, about solar panels and wind turbines. And they just keep saying, oh, you have those subsidies are unfair, and so I'm going to put countervailing duties, which are just tariffs, but different kinds of tariffs, on your goods, and this is what is making the solar panels and the wind turbines really expensive, and therefore less likely to be transferred. So we have this big problem. I think the World Trade Organization could play a really important role, and they just haven't taken this leadership. It's actually an area where they really could, and it could re-energize this institution that's kind of dying because it hasn't done much in the past, well, since 2007 or so. So this is where I think there is potential, and it could actually be really impactful. It just hasn't happened yet. For carbon capture and storage, I just found out actually that whales absorb a lot of carbon more so than trees. So maybe one of the solutions is have more whales. But carbon capture and storage, the issue I see is, well, okay, so I'm thinking about climate geoengineering more generally, right? It's not just carbon capture and storage. We're talking solar radiation management, which I'm not entirely clear on what it does, but what I understand is you put mirrors that reflect the sun, and so it prevents the earth from heating. There's a lot of really fascinating technologies like these, but we're messing with a system that we already, like, we're not quite sure how everything interacts, right? And so one of the big challenges here is we're trying to fix a problem, but are we actually going to create others? So it fits really nicely into this panel. But this, to me, is one of the big question marks about these kinds of technologies. But we've been talking about the need to change behaviors, the need to mitigate emissions, the need to adapt to existing emissions. We've been talking about climate geoengineering. To me, all of this needs to happen at the same time. We can't just do one of those things. We're going to need everything happening at the same time if we want to even stand a chance.
Well, this is very, very, very helpful clarification. And let me just say that I actually am not in love with any one technology. I'm just in love with the democratic process. And therefore, I yearn for some way of finding, as I said, meet the public half the way, rather than having to remake them in the way we like to see them. And therefore, I find it very revealing and helpful to be reminded that some part of our community will viscerally object to anything which is easy, because they will feel if it's not painful, then it's not right. So there's somewhat like exercises for dieting. If you don't suffer, then you're not really exercising. And so if you can get around that, I think we will be closer to a solution. Now, John, by all means, but we need to get the audience in. But no.
There is. I agree that behavioral change is hard and it takes a long time, but there is an entirely new way of thinking about the production of goods, principally goods and services, that we haven't touched on that is relevant. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the expression the circular economy, but effectively we now live in a linear economy. We extract stuff out of the ground, we build something, we use it, and we throw it away. Right? The circular economy talks about building into products repair, reuse, and recycling opportunities so that there are, in fact, fewer products being used and in multiple ways over extended periods of time and with much less original inputs. So it does not obviate the need for behavioral change, but it's a different way of thinking about the manufacturing process and the business models that go around this.
And the EU just got the right to repair products into, more recently something just happened about that. Instead of having more things on hand to actually be able to repair, washers, dryers, things like that.
Having been involved in the development of the idea of circular economy for now about 20 years, and it's a wonderful idea. It absolutely is something that ought, like good ways of renewable energy, it ought to be employed about as fast as it's possible. And it doesn't take much behavioral change. It's just a matter of changing our infrastructure to design products that are long-lived instead of obsolescent and can be repaired easily. It can be shared. All of these parts are parts of the circular economy. But the best estimates of the decoupling of the material economy from the growth of GDP that's available by even the circular economy aren't enough. And that's the basic problem I keep coming back to. These are good technologies. They help us. They put off some of the more dire consequences, but they're not enough. They don't solve the problem.
Okay.
So Jonathan's absolutely right. It's a wonderful idea. There's a brand new book on it by an old colleague of mine, Walter Stahl, just came out a few weeks ago. And it's something that's worth looking at and talking very seriously about.
Well, thank you very much. Please join us. Sir, if you mind coming to the microphone so everybody be able to hear you.
I apologize if you covered this earlier, but a couple of things. I'd like to hear a little bit about carbon pricing, because that seems critical to drive the technology change, to change behavior. And, you know, this technology just changed my behavior. It just bothered me and made me want to answer it. And it's changing the behavior of our kids, even the way their brains are wired. And it seems to me that we can use technology to change behavior, even though it's tough to do. There are some answers in there. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe take two more questions.
I guess I have the dubious distinction here.
You could ask a question?
Yeah.
Please.
I live in South Florida as my main address. And when I first bought a place here in Southwest and attended a SWANA meeting, FEMA was there, and I raised my hand and started to ask about sea level rise and climate change, and everybody looked at me like I had three heads. I live in a place on the opposite coast of where there's red tide, and last week, along with people in this room, I attended the Citizens Climate Lobby and lobbied people on the Hill about Bill 763, which has to do with taxing carbon and giving distributions to poor people. And there are 7 such bills that aren't making quick headway. Maersk, on its own, has decided to eliminate its emissions, and they're giving a target date of 2050. There's a lot of things I could say. Today I heard on the radio that the deforestation rate in the Amazon is at the highest it's ever been in the history of the Amazon. My question, or my statement, what I want people to address is the one thing I haven't heard. I've heard a little bit on Andrea's part, alluded to, but the fact is there is no sense of urgency here, and it is urgent and it is dire. We're losing, I think I heard the quote of 200 species a day. That might be a little harsh, but I think I heard that. And it's mind-boggling. I mean, when they say crisis, we're in a heightened state of emergency, and nobody's listening.
Thank you. One more.
I'd like to hear from Mr. Silver about how financing connects with this problem, because you've said that there are billions of dollars to be made out there, and yet it seems as though we continue to need incentives from the government, solar tax credits and co-investment plans, and I don't understand how you see the role of financing connecting with the role of technology.
Thank you. So please take your turns, but not everybody is to answer all the questions.
Well, then I'll answer the financing one, and I'll leave the others. Thank God, I actually know something about that one. There's something called a technology S-curve, and it shows where the evolution of a technology is on its way to commercial deployment, right? So you start in the lab, and then you come out and you're doing a pilot project and a demonstration project, and it begins to be commercially viable, but the first one's very expensive, and then it reaches maturity and it's viable. So the question is, how do you accelerate that S-curve? How do you accelerate technology deployment along the S-curve? And the answer is you use certain kinds of incentives, whether they're public policy or financial incentives, at different points along the path with different so early on you're using grants, later on you're using certain kinds of financing incentives, particularly around credit enhancements, and then you use other things like investments and investment tax credits and the like. So the ideal place for the government to play a role is in commercial deployment, crossing that chasm as that people often say, between the first one, which is really expensive, and the N one, the last one in the sequence, which is not. And the proof positive of that is, for example, in the loan program, which the Department of Energy ran during the Obama administration, we provided capital for the first called CSP, concentrated solar power. This is the giant tower in the middle with all the panels reflecting the sunlight to the tower. I won't go into any more of the technologies, but that's that particular cycle. As a result, a dozen of those were built around the world. They're very large and very expensive. But they were the remaining dozen were built with private sector capital. So there are two parts to the answer. One is the government needs to step in where there is not private sector capital because nobody wants to back a first-of-the-kind technology. And then as soon as the private capital markets are willing to do that, the government should step out. Once the government when you've reached that kind of commercial deployment, there is a tsunami of capital available in the markets today looking for these kinds of technologies.
To the woman who talked about the urgency, I agree. I hear it. I hear it in my colleagues here, and I certainly hear it out in the world. We need a behavioral change, but there has to be a behavioral change in the political system of the U.S. and other places to accept that this is a problem of urgency. There's a lot of inertia built in. As Jonathan said, it's too late, really, to make this problem go away. It's not going to go away. We've waited too long. But every day we wait, it adds to the inertia of the system and makes whatever we do to try to mitigate the consequences all that much harder. Without that kind of political leadership globally, we can't get together the right kind of energies, commitments that are necessary. You want you want to put a price on carbon? Absolutely. The economists tell us it's by far the most direct way to begin to change behavior to get away from the use of carbon. But I haven't seen much action toward it. So yes, we need both behavioral change from folks like us here in the room, but if we don't get it at the higher level, it's not going to, I predict, my crystal ball is just as fuzzy as everybody's, but we're not going to get very far along on our way to begin to make this whole set of problems go away. And that's really I'd say the objective. It's not to solve them, it's to make them go away.
Well, I'm going to be a little less depressing for a second. I know, right? About urgency. And granted, I'll start with, urgent was like 15 years ago. But when it comes to especially like these local issues, the best way to solve them, and I know like we're screaming at like our national government to do something, pulling out of the Paris Accord and seeing this as a global issue and being paralyzed as individuals. Some of the best starting points is your municipal government. They're in charge of zoning to make and building codes to make sure, especially where the Cs are having where you are, making sure the building standards are changed. If we want to employ some of these technologies in the right places right now, it's either running yourself or making sure whoever's looking at those local seats, it's so easy to get a hold of your county commissioner. You ever try getting a meeting in Congress? I mean, like in comparison, like your county commission, like that's what they're there for. And so these local folks who are there to do things like fill your potholes, that's what they're there for. And they can start employing these technologies. Cities we know are, at least in the beginning, starting to pave these ways. And in doing so, it's knowing what's, hurricane structural integrity, getting that in a local, like right there, so that has to be up front. Making sure people have to move or elevate homes from the sea. Even just as simply as either painting white so that you don't have the urban heat island issue of having too much heat in your cities, or putting local gardens in to bring down heat. I mean, or that's local vegetables for people. There's so many different little things, and these are easy municipal changes that are also not expensive, not heavy duty, because again, counties don't usually have as much money, in a pot to then have to potentially on these more expensive projects go higher. But that is something citizens can do and you can own much easier than staring down the barrel of, oblivion, which is what it normally feels like.
All right, so I'm going to address the carbon pricing question. This is something that it takes me multiple lectures to go through usually, but I'm going to try to do it in just a few sentences. There's a number of carbon price mechanisms that have been put in place, and generally economists consider that a tax would be the best way of doing it because it's very transparent, it's very clear. So far, most of the ways that we've done it is through carbon trading systems. So the emissions trading scheme in Europe would be one of the examples. And we've learned some lessons about, the ways to make it work better. We made some mistakes at the beginning. To be fair to economists, most of the mistakes were political. The idea that, in order to alleviate some of the burden on the firms, we actually made a lot of these allowances free for firms at the beginning, which means that we didn't really impose that much of a burden on them. And really, the biggest issue that we're facing is that the price that we're putting on carbon so far, no matter what tool we're using, is much below what it really needs to be, right? So the social cost of carbon is estimated to be about 50 euros per ton. The cost of carbon through the emissions trading scheme in Europe is about 25 to 30 euros per ton. And it's actually increased a lot in the past few years. It used to be zero pretty much, right? So we're making our way to a social or cost of carbon that is close to what it needs to be, but it's happening relatively slowly. And one of the main obstacles to passing those environmental regulations so far has been the fear that if you have environmental regulation, you're going to impose costs on your companies, and so they're not going to be competitive against the Chinese companies anymore, right? This is one of the main fears that we have. And what I just want to say really quickly is that we have very little evidence that this happens. That as a result of environmental policies, the costs are too high, your companies end up offshoring their production to developing countries, and you end up losing out on a whole bunch of jobs here. There's very, very little evidence empirically of this, and I have some research on that. I don't find evidence that this actually happens. Now, part of it might be because the cost of carbon right now is low, right? And when we move to 50 euros per ton, maybe those issues will start arising more, but so far, this fear has seemed to be unfounded, and so, it's a little bit of a shame that we never talk about it, considering that it is one of the main political obstacles to passing this regulation. And I just want to say very quickly to one of Jonathan's point, yes, you have, the government role can play, government interventions can be more useful at different stages of the adoption process, but in the end, environmental regulation overall have been shown to motivate a lot of innovation, but also of adoption of existing technologies that were developed by other countries, right? And in the end, they give certainty. And certainty is really key to get the investments that we need in renewable energies. And so sometimes the role of government is to just say, for the next 20 years, you know that we're going to back this up and that is going to be profitable. And that in and of itself is a really big deal.
Thank you. Let me just add one sentence. There were several times the phrase solving the problem was mentioned. I think we should think about the way we thinking about cancer. There are multiple causes, multiple problems. And if you can take out one here and ameliorate one here and slow one down here, that's, I think, the way we progress rather than kill or end cancer. I think there's an analog here. Above all, we want to see a trend toward amelioration rather a trend to making things worse. It's my feeling that if you look at everything together, we even not on a downtrend, we more at the moment on a trend of deepening the issue. So clearly, we're very far from talking about solving the problem. Would you please?
Hi, yes, Sarah Dillard. I'm the founder of Kaleidoscope, and we're building a high school class, Climate Science and Policy. The first semester is science, and the second semester uses each of the lenses of 7 major social sciences to look at the causes, impacts, and mitigation strategies for climate change. And so my question to the panel is, if you were designing such a high school class, what enduring understandings would you want to leave the high school students with?
I have a question for John and Andrea. And John, as a chemical engineer, you know for 50 years the profession has worked hard to ameliorate and clean up things, whether it was mustard gas bombs in northern Washington, D.C., or perchlorate cleanup all over the country, just to mention 2 specifically. But we didn't use one technology to do that in the profession. We used the technologies we had, did not give you your ultimate goal of a solution. And maybe there's no silver bullet, but we have to maybe intensify our efforts and continue doing what we've done for 50 years that I know of, and you probably may be able to go back further. I doubt it, but maybe. Andrea, I know I know you can see.
He was in kindergarten, come on.
I wasn't, but you talk about, I mean, you went through a bad year and you probably suffer from ecology PTSD right now. But also 50 years ago, and this is not anecdotal, this is real, less than a mile from here at Fort McNair, you could take off in a helicopter and you'd have to be at 4,000 feet before you could see the Potomac, because most houses in this metro area were heated by coal. And after you got through layers of green and yellow air, you finally broke through at 4,000 feet to clean air. You don't have that today. You can see the Potomac on a clear day from lots of places in this city. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot more to do, but all I'm saying is we have made progress. We need to continue making progress. That's all. Thank you.
One more question, please.
My name's David. If I'm reading those of you who are on the stage correctly, you're fans of entrepreneurship and the free market. So I wonder if you share, and as am I, and I wonder if you share my concern about the Green New Deal. It smells of command and control. Solyndra will be raised if the Democrats keep pushing what they're calling the Green New Deal. I'm concerned about that. Are you?
Well, we need all not to be briefer, but please.
I hope I haven't. I hope I've made myself clear here. Technology, when used in the right place, is almost always worthwhile doing it. But I've tried to point out that if it becomes the focus and if it takes us away from it looking for and dealing with the root causes, it's going to bite us sooner or later. That's the history of this. So yes, we ought to be looking at all of these solutions. But I believe the root cause is our consumption materialistic society. And if we don't change behavior, and I've written several books about this, I'll be immodest. I have my newest one here. It's just published last week. The efforts that we make toward using technology wisely are just not going to be enough. That's I want to make that clear. This is not a panegyric against technology. It's just not letting us lose sight of the ball.
So I just wanted to say about the Green New Deal, I actually see it more as a roadmap, right? It's something that says, that we need to make efforts to, reduce emissions. It doesn't really have a plan. So I don't read it as a command and control because it doesn't have a plan yet. I think it still leaves room for market-based mechanisms to be implemented. And so I would be really worried if they didn't have market-based policies available through the Green New Deal, but that's not how I read it personally, so I think there's still a possibility, and so in that sense, I feel relatively optimistic about it.
All right, let me see if I can very quickly run through this. For a high school class, please have them look into, I mean, following lobbyist money. Because it's really important for them to know, to be active citizens when it comes to climate, but to know who's funding what. Because sometimes that directly disengages just good governance outcomes, and to make sure they understand that what's really important too is that just because they're engaged, they have to know what they're up against, and that's really important. Secondly, we've made great strides in America prior to the EPA. Yes, big problems here of other places, but I can make a short list here. India had days looking like that. This just a couple of weeks ago, Mongolia looks like that in several of its largest cities now, currently, and several other places. So what's unfortunate is they've followed the same trajectory. So while we see that improvement, they've got to make that improvement because it's those same things. It's that coal-fired or coal stoves in those same places. And if we're not having that, if that continues to be what heats the world, those same trajectories means they have to have that same cleanup just like we did. But I completely agree about the Green New Deal. Like, this is a roadmap. It's a statement of principles. We can decide what those look like, or we can let someone decide for us. It's a matter of what it is we want to see. And as active citizens, I also teach lobbying. This is my plug. Like, you guys, we all have to care a little bit more, please. Like, yell at your governors and yell at your senators. But we have to. If we have ideas, we have to put those forward because there are a lot of people putting them out there for you. Seriously. So that's part of this. We have the ability with just a set of principles to guide this now. And we can make those decisions with green technologies, with just lifestyle ideas. And this is up to us to put those forth to our Congress and say, we think it should conclude this. It doesn't have to be someone telling you what it is. It can be up to us.
So I agree with what Andrea said. I would also say for the class that it's important, you know, we use those examples of the straws and the turtles, and those are really good illustrative examples of some of the issues that we're facing. But let's not forget that the straws are a very, very, very small part of the plastic consumption that we have, and so therefore it's not enough to just reduce that. And I think some of the risks of these kinds of illustrations is that people worry about the straws and they forget about everything else, right? So just, you know, keeping the big picture in mind as well.
So I'm going to unfortunately disagree with that. These are high schoolers, and I have two, and they can't remember what I asked them to do from the bottom of the stairs to the top of the stairs. So I think straws and things like that are a terrific idea. It is engagement that's important, not the size of it at this stage. And I think if your kids can find something that they can materially affect, and they can create a program in the school that gathers, you know, plastic bottles together, that's a fabulous way to begin. This is not, I mean, because I hope what you're doing, and I'm sure what you're doing, is you're not educating a high school kid today. You're creating a citizen of the world for tomorrow.
I have just one line for the high school. Don't lecture them, give them experiences. So take them to a meeting in which some changes are suggested for the neighborhood, and let them hear how many people will object to even small changes, and let them participate in the democratic process and learn to develop the democratic muscle. Or, now I'm going to go really overboard, and you need the permission of the parents, the principal, the school board, and I know the medical authorities. I'd like you to give them an experience what it was like in Delhi in the summer, when the temperature was above 120 and the pollution was maximum. 2 minutes of that, they will remember that.
Hi, I'm Chuck. I have a question on consumption. It seems ironic that we've come full circle back to the paradox of the commons, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that our economy, the growth of our economy, is based upon consumption. That if we don't consume in the United States, our economy goes down. So how do we get consumption down and not bankrupt ourselves or go into a massive depression? It seems like those are dichotomies?
Excellent question.
Good evening. Thank you all so much. This has been a fascinating conversation so far. Something we haven't talked terribly much about so far tonight is forests and the role of forests and woodland management. We talked a bit about carbon capture and storage, and I mean, wood is the original carbon capture and storage, and I'm wondering if any of you, speaking to the role of technology specifically, has done any research or has done reading on issues like the development of markets for like low quality biomass, right? So we have hundreds of millions of acres in this of forests in this country that need to be treated at risk of wildfire. What would be really helpful is the development of robust markets that sort of have, so that you have a place to put all of this low quality stuff that you're pulling out, so that we're not just high grading all over again. And also just curious if you've thought about biochar or things like that. I'm just interested in bringing forests into the conversation a little bit.
Thank you. Dr. Kellogg?
Hi, everybody. I want to say that I agree with everything everybody's saying on this. I think all the points are super valid, and it's such a complicated issue, so thank you for expressing it so clearly. I'm also a lobbyist for the Energy Innovation Act that we have that will put a price on carbon and return the fee to everybody equally. And I like it because I feel like it greases the wheels and makes everything else that we have to do easier. And I see it, I guess what I want to inject in the conversation is the idea that it's not really an either or, that we can all win in this sort of, as those who like investment can say there are trillions of dollars to be made. And also, in addition to climate activist, I'm a friend and advocate for indigenous people, and I know personally how there's a richer life when we simplify. And so I wish we could, I guess, convince people of that. And my final point, I guess, which perhaps you can address, is the exportation of our culture. I've heard that phrase said a few times on the stage, and what I've seen is it's not so much our culture as a proud American, it's our marketing. And I wonder if there's a way that we can say that aspect of speech, this gets very delicate, perhaps we need to look at whether we control that, because there's a lot of headspace that gets taken through marketing, and they're very good at what they do. And so maybe I can throw that out there, and thank you for your time.
Before I give you a chance for very last words, and they're going to be short, there's a question in the audience for some reason didn't come to the microphone, so I like to channel it. And that was the question which you guys briefly about equity. How are we going to do that without increasing social injustice some more? So 2 seconds for each.
So I actually think that environmental inequalities and income inequalities reinforce each other. So solving one is actually going to help solve the other. So I see them as completely complementary. About the growth aspect, it's tricky, and there is a part of environmental economics, ecological economics, which is more niche, that talks about degrowth and the need that we have to actually degrow the economy in order to reduce emissions and get to the point where we want to be. It's quite controversial. It's not clear to me how it would happen. But one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, people are more unhappy about inequality, so their income relative to the income of other people, than they are about the absolute level of their income. And so, you know, reducing growth is mostly going to be an issue because we need a lot of money to actually fix the problem. But if reducing growth allows us to not have to spend so much money in the future to fix the problem, then it might be part of the solution. It's a bit confusing, but yeah, this is. Thank
you. Yeah, consumption's about 60% of the GDP, so it's the problem if you look at that as a problem. It is difficult to degrow economies, and it's questionable whether the growth of GDP would really solve the problem, because the material the decoupling material consumption from GDP is difficult. But quick answer, I do believe that you can change behavior. I think all of us would be willing to sacrifice our material values and wealth in exchange for flourishing, for good life, for seeing yourself expressed. It's not a sacrifice. We don't have that real opportunity in this economy because marketing is part of the culture. It's just part of the whole machine. And I think it's possible, but it would take a change of values at the core. But I think when one stops and looks at what's happening, that all of us would be open to that kind of non-sacrifice.
We don't want to degrow the economy. We want to grow the economy. And we want to grow the economy as robustly as we can. We just want to allocate what we grow to the right places. That's about the public making decisions. It's not about limiting the economy. It's about making choices as voters as to what we want to have happen. I want to address forests because I spent many years as a member of the board of and the chair of a group called American Forests, which is the largest, oldest forest conservation group in the country. Your point is well taken. Forests have an incredibly important role to play. The challenge has been that as forest products companies and others have culled their lands, they've planted rapid growth trees which are not as robust and don't provide the full ecosystem support that a healthy ecosystem does. So two things. One is you got to plant more trees, and the second is you got to plant the right kind of trees in the right kind of places. You got to rebuild ecosystems, not just plant trees. We didn't get that right for a long time, even though we were well-intentioned. We were planting trees everywhere, and so was everybody else. But actually, it's much more important what you plant and where you plant it. There are, as I'm sure you know from the basis of your question, a number of investment funds now focused on land investments, wood products, sort of second and third generation wood products efforts, et cetera. But probably the single best thing you can individually do and your high school students can do is to get involved with a local ecosystem rehabilitation project and make sure you're planting some trees. Changing the forest canopy, the tree canopy in an urban environment is a hugely important aspect of recovering these areas.
Quick note, I guess, on forestry. It's not my main thing. By any stretch of the imagination, I work with some amazing forestry people, but it's shocking where you see the growing of the wrong trees. After a very long flight hopper driving through the middle of Fiji, I fell asleep for a second in my taxi, and I woke up like nodding off in a pine forest. No joke. I was really effing confused because I was like, wait, I am in Fiji, right? And so I asked my cab driver, why am I in a pine forest? And so they grow pine there now, and then they'll ship that off to China, who will make paper, then sell it right back to Fiji. So a lot of crazy forest mismanagement when they could be making more money out of mahogany. But the fires we see right now ravaging, which are 3 or 4 times the size of the Amazon, are in Australia, and that's because of poor management, not cleaning that undergrowth that you're talking about and managing it. This last government took a 35% decrease in the funding to those cleanup efforts, and look what we have now. Sad burn koalas. So this is a really important and factful piece of the future, is to not be mismanaging our forests. But I think the overall thoughts on how we look at this in the economy is people need stuff to do, which I know just sounded really flat and like duh, but I mean, when we think about what those transitions look like, and we think about how automation has changed our lives and the benefits that we've gotten from the sake of the conveniences, if we have to go back to slowing things down in some ways and making changes for what we want to invest in, thinking about what we do to keep people busy, what do people do that are valuable tasks again. Because we've done a wonderful job of being uber convenient. And what we think of as making things just like that linear economy. I mean, fast fashion has ruined us. instead of having, and my students luckily have been very concerned about that. I give them a lot of credit for finally thinking this through. But all of these things that we quickly just throw away versus thinking about what do we want to invest in, what should we have for the long run, what tasks do we need for the long run to have people do. So if it's one industry changing, where do we put people that we actually need things, and to be really thinking that through. Because otherwise, of course there's going to be uprisings of jobs that go under. Does anyone here work at a Blockbuster? But in being very thoughtful about what has value and what we want to pay people for and how that industry has to change. It's not that the economy maybe doesn't end up degrowing or having to change, but what do we want to be paying people to do? Because that has to reflect our value system of the future.
So I'm closing. Let me tell you, if you indulge me just for 30 seconds, I just saw a movie called Ask Dr. Ruth. It's a celebration of the sex therapist's 90th year birthday. And she was asked, well, you give all this advice to other people, what's happening in your home? And she said, I never allow my husband to come to these meetings because if he'll come, he'll say, it's all talk. So the reason I'm telling you, when you go home, let's not make it all talk. Let's do something about those straws or whatever moves you, but let's lean in there and help the environment. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to thank our very excellent panel. Let me just tell you, we're going to use the theater language. We're going to go dark in November and December for the holidays, but I hope very much to see you in January, where we're going to discuss some heavy philosophical issues between liberals and conservatives. Please help me thank this excellent panel.